Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin the afternoon program. And I see we still have some folks coming in through the door. The afternoon begins with a highlight, and it ends with a highlight. And the highlight we're kicking off with this afternoon is a keynote presentation by Dr. David Kendall. And I will briefly introduce David and then turn it over to him. David has more than 40 years of experience in the space sector. His educational background includes MSc and PhD degrees in atmospheric physics from the University of Calgary. Dr. Kendall has also been a long-standing faculty member of the International Space University in Strasbourg, France. And I know that several students have asked me about ISU, and this is a man who can tell you all about it. Dr. Kendall joined the government space program in 1982 and the Canadian Space Agency upon its creation in 1989 as a research scientist. 15 years later, in 2004, he held the title of Director General, Space Science. And by 2014, his role at CSA was Senior Executive Advisor to the President. In that year, he was appointed to chair the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space for the 2016-2018 term, having joined the Canadian delegation to UN COPUOS in 2008. Just by way of background, Canada is a founding member of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, and our continued participation is ensured through the coordinated efforts of Global Affairs Canada and the Canadian Space Agency. Through consultation with other government departments, the Canadian delegation represents our national interests and policy positions at UN COPUOS and its subcommittee sessions. And UN COPUOS has quite a few subcommittees. I'm sure David will tell us about that. David's keynote presentation this afternoon is entitled Reflections on the Safety, Security, and Sustainability of Outer Space, the UN COPUOS Context. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Kendall.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here and get this thing going here. I'll just wake it up. Yeah, let me click it here. Well, first of all, let me please let me allow me to thank the organizers of this important and I think very timely meeting for especially Jeff Languedoc, Jacques Giroux, if Jacques here or not, Christiane Lange and Michel Faragalli for giving me this opportunity to talk about reflections on the safety, security, and sustainability of outer space, the UN COPUOS context. Before I start my talk, I would just like to mention one more thing about my background. It's really fantastic to be back in this magnificent city. I had the great fortune, before I joined the Canadian Space Program in '82, and thanks to ABB, which at that time was BOMEM, and thanks to my good friend Henry Bige, who's sitting in the front, to be invited and to work here in Quebec City for 4 years. It was a magnificent time between 1978 and 1982. ABB was going through its fantastic growth phase at that point in time, and to be part of that remarkable team, and it still is a remarkable team at ABB, it was a huge pleasure. I had a young family at that point in time, and I fondly remember my very young children playing almost every Sunday on the Champ de la Bataille. It was a splendid period. So thank you, Henry. And the other thing I'd like to just make a comment before I start my presentation is that if somebody was to have told me, and this is really to the students in the audience, if somebody was to have told me when I was doing my PhD or in Calgary or working for BOMEM, that I would be standing up here 40 years later and giving a talk on policy in the United Nations context, I would have told them they were absolutely crazy. That would have not even crossed my mind. You know, the path between there and now has been long and interesting, and it's been a great ride. as a number of students have asked me, you know, what advice could you give me as I'm looking at developing my career? And my answer almost inevitably is keep your options open. Just don't close doors. Just look at what's out there. There are a lot of very interesting things, and it doesn't have to be engineering. It doesn't have to be science. It doesn't have to be exactly what you're doing, because your career, if you keep your options open, could take you in surprising places. And I find looking back, this is surprising. So anyway, the other point I'd like to make is that some of you may have heard parts of this talk before. I gave a very similar talk at the Canadian SmallSat Workshop Symposium, last February. And parts of this I presented on Monday at the Space System Resilience Workshop. So I'm sorry if you've seen some of this before, but hopefully you'll. I'm going to try and make it a little different, but you'll recognize some of it if you were at those particular presentations. I'd also like to thank Mary Preville for the introduction in her presentation yesterday. And as Jeff quite rightly pointed out, the fact that I'm here and that I'm the chair of COPUOS is due to the fact that it's really a team effort, and the great support that the team at the CSA and Global Affairs have provided to me personally in my role as a chair of the committee. And it is really a team effort. And what I am presenting today is the result of a work of quite a number of very talented and dedicated people within the CSA and elsewhere, and I just want to make sure that that's understood. Now, as was mentioned during the first panel yesterday morning, from a global perspective, we are currently experiencing sorry, I'm just going to do something quickly here. Yeah, okay. We are experiencing a dynamic, exciting, optimistic and accelerating period in the utilization and development of outer space. In general, global budgets for space activities are increasing, in many cases dramatically. More and more players are entering the arena. Governments, as we heard yesterday, are reassessing their roles and mandates with respect to how space activities are funded, managed, and conducted in their countries. And the private sector has become the dominant actor in the development of new technologies and applications. As a graphic example, on February the 6th this year, the world witnessed a remarkable space event that was widely reported in the global press. I'm speaking, of course, of the successful and impressive launch of the Falcon Heavy rocket, including the extraordinary ballet performed by the returning boosters, and of course, as everybody knows, the audacious payload. However, what was not reported 2 days later was, in my somewhat biased opinion, an even more significant event in the global space world, and that took place in Vienna within a publicly little-known United Nations committee where 87 nations, including all the world's major and minor space powers, agreed on 21 new non-binding guidelines on how to conduct activities in outer space in order to sustain this fragile and threatened environment for current and especially future generations. Now, for my presentation today, I would like to provide a brief overview of the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, commonly known as UN COPUOS, as well as some of the major initiatives that the committee is undertaking in relation to the overall global space program, as well as how those initiatives are and will impact Canada. In many ways, the spectacular SpaceX launch that captured the interest of a significant fraction of the world's population illustrates a dichotomy that the space enterprise is currently facing. Namely, in today's world where space is becoming ever more essential to an expanding number and diversity of clients, and consequently, to an ever-increasing assortment of entrepreneurs wishing to provide services to these customers and consumers, how can we put some sensible rules in place to govern outer space now and into the future? COPUOS was created by the United Nations 59 years ago in 1959 with 18 states, and as Jeff pointed out, including Canada as a founding member. As noted, today the committee comprises of 87 member states, and with 3 more applications to be approved this year, and 37 intergovernmental and non-governmental international organizations as permanent observers, with an accelerating increase in membership over the past several years. Of note, we have increased our membership by 30% since 2010. Now, COPUOS's mandate is broad, including defining and strengthening the international legal regime governing space activities, as well as building a collaborative approach to address vulnerabilities and sustainability of space activities. However, for those here today who are familiar with COPUOS, you are probably cognizant of a number of legally binding treaties, declarations, and principles created by the committee, the most well-known being the so-called Outer Space Treaty, ratified by 105 nations and a further 25 states, that sets out the basic rules of how nations should conduct their activities in outer space. This landmark agreement was adopted by the UN General Assembly and came into force in 1969, that's 51 years ago, in the early years of space accomplishments. Now, while COPUOS, effectively supported by an impressive secretariat, the Office for Outer Space Affairs, is one of the larger and more productive of United Nations bodies, nevertheless, the space business has changed dramatically over the past half-century, and the pace, as noted, is accelerating. Witness the successful development and launch of the world's most powerful rocket in February, and somewhat on the other end of the scale, a parallel event featuring a much smaller, but nevertheless noteworthy launch vehicle from New Zealand 16 days before that. The important point being that both developments were financed solely by private capital, and no government funds were required. But these developments implicitly examine the current rules governing the safety, security, and sustainability, and ultimately the stability of outer space, and the need to update the current treaties, declarations, and principles to reflect the contemporary and especially future developments in the business, with the question of how to manage this situation given the lack of any appetite to try and craft new, enforceable legal instruments by virtue of the fundamental differences in opinions on even how to start such an exercise within the 193 member states that comprise the United Nations. Now, COPUOS is, however, the only body with a mandate to try and find a way forward with respect to this dilemma, since it serves as the unique platform for promoting international cooperation in the peaceful uses and exploration of outer space on a global scale, facilitating the rule of law in outer space and capacity building in space technology and its applications for the benefits of all nations, and in particular, developing countries. In order to assess current and future trends in the space domain and to ensure that the committee is considering contemporary issues, it has developed a series of forums over the past 60 years known as the United Nations Conferences on the Exploration and Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, or UNISPACE. These have been held in 1968, 1982, and 1999, and are an opportunity to assemble a group of experts, non-state actors, and other stakeholders to discuss and develop proposals for the future agenda of the committee. Just as an aside, you probably have realized from what I've been talking about here that the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, and in fact all United Nations activities, are governed by states. We do not have the private sector as part of our committee. We do not have the academic sector as part of our committee. So therefore, we need to find ways to ensure that the message that these other groups provide are incorporated into our thinking, and that is tricky, and that is something which we really need to work harder on. And these Unispace conferences are a way to do that. During the last such conference in 1999, a number of key issues were raised, and the committee's agenda adjusted to work towards improving the governance of space activities in some specific areas, leading to new programs relating to asteroid threats, the use of nuclear power sources in outer space, remote sensing for disaster management and emergency response, and the coordination of emerging international global navigation satellite systems. One other important discussion arising from the 1999 conference centered around the long-term sustainability of the outer space environment. After several years of deliberations, and in 2009, a working group of the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee under the title Long-Term Sustainability of Outer Space Activities was created. A 4-year work plan for this working group was developed for the period 2010 to 2014 under the chairmanship of Peter Martinez of South Africa, with a specific mandate to produce a series of consensual, voluntary, non-binding guidelines that would inform states of best practices to ensure that the space environment would remain sustainable for current and future generations, again taking into special consideration the needs of developing and emerging space powers. Under the skillful guidance of the chair and with the strong support of and the intercession by several key states, including Canada, important progress was made, and the work plan of the working group was extended twice, once to 2016, during which 12 guidelines were agreed to, and more recently to 2018, when consensus was reached back in last February on a further 9 guidelines. Now, the importance of the success of this exercise cannot be overstated. A result that frankly exceeded everybody's expectation. It is the first time since 1976, 42 years ago, that states with active space programs, although with strongly differing geopolitical outlooks, have successfully concurred on a comprehensive, broad agreement governing the conduct of activities in outer space. And it bodes well for hopefully further coordination and cooperation on how we can collectively preserve the fragile in space environment for future generations. But what does all this mean in practical terms for you here today and for Canada's current and future space program? Well, I think the answer is quite a lot. The guidelines discussed by the working group recognize current and future threats that need to be addressed if we are to ensure the safety, security, and sustainability of space. We are all here acutely aware of the space debris issue. Last year, over 460 objects were launched into space, approximately twice the number of the previous year, with more than 300 of those objects being in the small satellite class of between 1 and 50 kilograms. And these numbers are predicted to dramatically increase in the coming years. And I just note that already in 2018, 210 objects will have been launched into space by the end of May, and some 6,000 objects, satellites in fact, are planned to be launched over the next decade. However, there are many other areas, especially in relation to transparency and confidence-building measures, where we need to do better. So let's be a little bit more specific. What are the topics covered by the approved guidelines are broad and include aspects such as enhancing the practice of registering space objects, improving the accuracy of orbital data on space objects, and enhancing the practice of and utility of sharing orbital information on these objects, promoting the collection, sharing, and dissemination of space debris monitoring information, providing updated contact information and sharing information on space objects and orbital events, performing conjunction assessment during all orbital phases of controlled flight, designing the operation of space objects regardless of their physical and operational characteristics specifically to increase their trackability. Addressing the risks of uncontrolled atmospheric re-entries, the adoption, revision, and amendment of national regulatory frameworks for outer space activities, the sharing of operational space weather data and forecasts, and promoting the awareness of space sustainability through the sharing of experiences relating to the long-term sustainability of outer space activities and the development of new procedures for information exchange. Now, for those of you who are interested and perhaps like policy issues, a full set of the guidelines, both those that have been agreed to and those still under consideration, can be found on the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs website, which is given on that slide. So where do we go from here? In the preamble to the compendium of guidelines, the following statement can be found. States and international intergovernmental organizations should voluntarily take measures through their own national or other applicable mechanisms to ensure that the guidelines are implemented to the greatest extent feasible and practicable in accordance with their respective needs, conditions, and capabilities. Thus, while these guidelines are voluntary and non-binding, the 87 states that have agreed to them, including Canada, that, as mentioned, has been very actively engaged from the start of this exercise, are clearly obliged to include these guidelines as they develop future national space-related legislation and practices. And some states, in fact, are already implementing some guidelines through national policies and practice. Now, it is an open question right now as to whether Canada will develop new legislation in the space domain. Many of us, and this has been quite an active discussion in the Canadian space community, that some new legislation in the space domain for Canada is necessary, making it a little bit more effective and efficient. And if and when that happens, then these guidelines will absolutely have to be considered since Canada is a signatory to this process. Okay, so lastly, I'll just talk a little bit of the future. As I have noted already, the other major initiative that COPUOS has been working on during the past few years is the next in the series of United Nations conferences on the exploration and peaceful uses of outer space. The latest gathering, is called Unispace Plus 50, which will celebrate the 50th anniversary of the first such conference in 1968, will take place in June of this year in Vienna, almost 20 years after the seminal 1999 conference, and a set of 7 new agenda items for the committee called thematic priorities has been agreed to. And these are, as shown on the slide, space exploration and innovation, an international framework for space weather services, strengthened cooperation for global health, international cooperation towards low emission and resilient societies, capacity building, enhanced information exchange on space objects and events, and the legal regime of outer space and global governance. Let me just point out a couple of those. First of all, space weather services. Well, space weather services is something which has been discussed the last couple of days, certainly at the Resiliency Workshop. We need to have a much better global awareness of what's going on and coordination. And there has been a paper just published for those of you interested in this subject, in space weather and policy, that has just been provided and published in the Journal of Space Weather. You can see the reference in the slide. Another one is strengthen cooperation for global health. You heard from the President of the Canadian Space Agency about the thrust that the Canadian Space Agency is looking at, possibly to increase its, I would say, its work in the medical field, especially related to, obviously, astronaut health, but the way that can be spun off onto systems that can be used for remote communities. And this is where one of the areas where the UN COPUOS is going to be focusing on in the future, on a much more global scale. And this particular area was led by Pascal Michel, who's the chief scientist for the Public Health Service of Canada. Now, of specific interest to the theme of this presentation is really the last two in this list that are placeholders for future deliberations and hopefully consensus on some of the 7 outstanding guidelines currently under discussion, as well as introduction of possibly new guidelines. Now, what you might notice from this list of guidelines that I put forward, there's some very interesting ones that have been so far not agreed to. And I include challenging issues such as the protection of terrestrial space infrastructures, active debris removal, the intentional destruction of space objects, natural resource exploitation in outer space, clarity on the rules of ownership of outer space objects, safe rendezvous and proximity operations, and modifications of the space environment and cybersecurity. All these areas are certainly under discussion by COPUOS, but to get the 87 states of the committee to agree on a way forward to protect these areas for the sustainability is still a challenge for us, and we're still working on this. So certainly this will be continued as part of the Unispace Plus 50 process, and thus one can, with a degree of certainty, ensure that future meetings of COPUOS will not lack for drama. In conclusion, I hope that I have demonstrated that the success that COPUOS has so far achieved through the agreement of 21 sustainability guidelines will have a significant impact in relation to the future of outer space activities over the long term. Furthermore, these decisions and agreements will need to be considered as Canada's space policy and legislative frameworks are refreshed in the future. And lastly, COPUOS has set itself on a path to discuss and address further contemporary space issues that will result in additional developments in space governance over the coming years. I hope that Canada will continue to be fully engaged in this essential process, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Well, that has left us lots of time for questions, David, and you've really just sort of tickled us with a few ideas here. I have a couple that I will take pride of place here as the moderator to begin with, and that may also serve to trigger questions in the minds of the audience. One of the questions I have about anything to do with international law or guidelines is, so for Canada, what would be the process whereby we could, as irrevocably as possible, commit ourselves to observing these guidelines and complying with treaties? What by means of what process do we actually bind ourselves, or do we even bind ourselves?
An excellent question, and one really that should be directed towards the Global Affairs Canada, that of course is the body in Canada that deals with the international treaties and areas that I've been discussing here. There is, as I mentioned, a fairly active debate going on in Canada as to whether Canada needs to refresh its legislation with respect to space. I think in general, there's a very broad consensus that yes, we do. Canada needs to update some of the legislation that's a bit long in the tooth now. There's an active discussion on the Remote Sensing Act that needs to be looked at, and we know that many countries around the world are putting in place new legislative frameworks, or space acts, let's say. The UK is very active in this area. France, many other European countries. Of course, the US has put forward its so-called Commercialization Space Act recently. Luxembourg, the United Arab Emirates, I could go on. Australia, which was mentioned this morning, has a new space agency, and therefore is generating new legislative frameworks for space. Whether or not that will happen, or I wouldn't say whether, I think it really has to happen. What the timetable for that is, I don't have any insight, but it is a very good question. And my point is, of course you raised this, is that when we come to refresh our legislation as in Canada with respect to space, we absolutely have to take these guidelines into account. We can't just ignore them and say, oh yes, we signed them, but they're voluntary, non-binding. That's not the way that soft law works. Soft law works in that if you sign something, really, you have to have a pretty darn good reason as to why you don't want to follow through with these, with what you've just agreed to. So these have a lot more strength than just saying, oh, they're voluntary, non-binding. We don't really want to. We find ourselves in a difficult situation to try and implement them. Well, why did you sign them in the first place? I mean, it's not something which I think we can just get away with on that sort of level. So yes, there will be. This will, again, the point of my talk, I guess, this will affect the way that we do space throughout the world, and not specially, but in Canada as an example. Yeah.
Right. So, so the corollary would be, or not the corollary, but the mechanism whereby Canada would give effect to its commitment to these guidelines would be that we need to enforce them on our own actors, I believe. Yeah. So when Canada signs up to do something, what we're saying is that we as a government believe, excuse me, that we can actually give effect to these guidelines and recommendations and provisions. We can give effect to them so that we can control our own actors, and every country similarly would do the same that was a party to these agreements. What happens in the event that a Canadian company behaves out of compliance with something that we've agreed to as a nation within the UN COPUOS arena?
Mm-hmm. A good question, and in fact that has already, as many of you know in the audience probably know, that's already been tested in some level. I'm sure most of you know that earlier this year an Indian rocket put in space four four satellites from a US private company called Swarm. These are called Space Bees, and they were not registered by the US, which is part of the United Nations actually treaty on outer space activities. And India never checked whether or not what they were flying, in fact, had been registered properly. What happened next, or what's happening now, is that the US federal authorities are going after this company and basically have the power really to shut them down. And they will shut them down, I think, unless they can prove that in the future they will comply with what you know. But I think the point you make here is a very good one, is that, and it's all part of this thesis here, that as we become more and more engaged and there's more and more commercial players, more and more entrepreneurs that are trying to do something, you know, disruptive, special, make a few bucks, whatever. We have now to look very carefully at what these rules are in space, and each country, and it is on the country. It's not, you know, there's no United Nations police force out there. It is each country has to make sure that their actors, because they are ultimately responsible. The liability convention means that if those space bees go and strike something, it's the US that is liable because they were. It could be India because it's an Indian company that actually India launched it. But again, there's an interesting. I would say open. There's some issues dealing here with also ownership. You know, would the US be liable? Would India be liable? Because, you know, anyway, these are the sort of things which these loopholes we need now to close, because it is becoming more and more difficult to control the outer space regime, and this is exactly where we're trying to go.
Right. Well, that's an eloquent argument for us all to get more involved in space law. it's so very important. And we do have a couple of sessions that address topics in that area. So if you're interested, I'd encourage you to go. So questions from the floor. Vicky first.
Sure. So you mentioned Unispace as a way for interested parties to engage with UN COPUOS as the guidelines go forward. Has UN COPUOS, with these new guidelines, recognized other expert groups? I'm talking here about COSPAR, but there may be other groups as well, and it'd be useful to understand that new relationship.
Yeah, thank you, Vicky. Yes, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have 87 members, and 37 the member states are the ones that sort of really, are most important. But we have 37 permanent observers. These international intergovernmental organizations. COSPAR is one of them. COSPAR, in fact, was one of the founding. I think COSPAR, in fact, was the first international intergovernmental organization that became a permanent observer of COPUOS many years ago now. So we have the IAF, we have the IAU, we have many of the scientific bodies are permanent observers. They can't take part in working group meetings, but what they can do is provide insight and guidance and help as we develop these type of guidelines. So, excuse me, we use them as a sounding board more or less, and they are very active. But they are limited as to what influence they have on the process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Jack?
Actually, my first question was about swarm, but I have another one. What happens if national rules and regulations in places like Luxembourg and the United States begin to diverge from the consensus being developed by organizations like UN COPUOS? How do you get everybody to play on the same page?
By very long discussions. The process that that I think you're implying here, Chuck, is that, or the issue that we're dealing with, of course, is space resources now, a very big one. The legal subcommittee has taken that up in a major way. There is a lot of intense discussions at the legal subcommittee currently as to how to move forward with the very differing views. I mean, there are a number of states which say the Outer Space Treaty says that you cannot take anything from any body and claim it as your own. Well, to some extent, the barn door has already has been opened up some time ago. If you consider that, so what about that massive store of lunar material in Houston? Yes, it's it's open for scientific research, and there's no restrictions on it, and the U.S. claims they're just keeping it, whatever. But still, in some level, you could say the U.S. has taken many tons of lunar material and dumped it in a repository in Houston. It's not for sale. It's not for public consumption. So there is certainly a difference between what the various companies in Luxembourg now or the legislation that has come out in the U.S. and Luxembourg want to do with it. But still. The question goes back, if you read the Outer Space Treaty, does it mean that you are absolutely not allowed to take a sample or a piece from a body, asteroid or the moon or Mars or wherever, and use it for your own use and to sell it? The US and Luxembourg claim, yes, you can. That's not forbidden in the treaty. Others would say, well, no, I think that the treaty, the way I read the treaty is that it's forbidden. In the end, if somebody wants to take, it hasn't happened yet, but if somebody wants to take a company or the country, or let's take a hypothetical situation here. In 5 years' time, Planetary Resources actually do fly to an asteroid. They take a chunk of the asteroid, they bring it back, and then they put it on eBay for sale or whatever. At that point in time, according to the US Commercial Space Act, they are allowed to do that. Another state can say you are in non-compliance with the Outer Space Treaty. what is the court of law which looks at that? And it is the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Now, in the 60s, 67, so in the what? Now we've got over 60 years since we've been in space. No country has taken another country to the International Court of Justice saying you are now not not in compliance with the treaty. That's never ever happened. So that's why you see many learned articles in space journals about the interpretation of the legal regime of space, because there's no case law. At some point, somebody's going to do that, and it's going to be an interesting exercise. But right now, it's very much open. So I'm not sure if I've completely answered your question, but I'm.
To be fair, I think that's a very good answer. I thank you very much.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes, of course. I guess I'll introduce Dr. Henry Buige. Dr. Buige is the founder of BOMEM, and which is now part of ABB, which is the anchor sponsor for this conference. Thank you, Dr. Buige.
Thank you.
Question?
The question is, we see more and more activity in greenhouse gas measurement. And of course, there are now commercial operations that want to do this on a spot basis, if you like, and get paid for it. But the question I have more in the other direction, where governments, for example, will start looking at ways of measuring very small footprints on the ground and contiguous over the whole globe, which means that they're really, in a way, spying on every country you can imagine. How does that square with the regulation on remote sensing? Can you comment on that?
Okay, the remote sensing, I'll have to, I can't quote the chapter and verse of the Outer Space Treaty. It means that there is, the way that I interpret the Outer Space Treaty is that there is no restriction on sensing another country, except that if you are requested, you have to provide the information that you have gathered from sensing that country to that country if they ask it. Okay. And you can also ask for a monetary, if it's going to cost the country who sensed, if you understand what I'm saying, money to produce that documentation or those images, you can not put a nominal sum on it. You can't say, well, that's going to cost you $2 million if you want to have that image. But the Outer Space Treaty very clearly says that if you've been sensed, and of course you have to first of all know you've been sensed, and you know what the image is, then you can request that image. That's the way that the treaty, and in fact, I know that in Global Affairs Canada, this is a part of their business. Their business is to send images that countries have asked for from RadarSat and other Canadian satellites that have basically sensed other countries. Yeah. If they request it, we are obliged, each country is obliged to send it. Now, of course, on the most part, it never happens because, millions of images are taken every day of all around the world. So, but that is the way that the Outer Space Treaty handles that. There's no restriction on you sensing another country. In fact, it can be very strongly argued that one of the reasons that the Outer Space Treaty was put in place, and with that non-restriction, one might say, on sensing, is in order to lessen the tension in that time. If you can see what's happening in another country, then it makes the world safer, effectively. And that's,
yeah, but in this case, it's a little bit the other way around. This is for compliance to greenhouse gas emissions to every country. And it may well be that some countries don't want this to be known. You know what I mean? So they're being sensed, and you get results. And if that is public, they might get very upset because they're not complying, obviously. So,
yeah, I don't think you can make it public. I don't think
okay, that's my question. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there's no obligation to make it public. The country that is sensing can use it for their own use, and the country that's been sensed can request a copy of it. That's the way that
And so that it won't be published, is that correct?
well, unless the country which is being censed wishes to make it public, I guess.
Yeah, I understand, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay, so it could be suppressed by the country that's being censored.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Hi, Jerry Sanders from NASA. I've spent a good portion of my career working on the concept of using space resources for government use, whether it's the moon or Mars for that matter. Part of that career is also looked at potentially off-ramps to commercializing it, and that's become more and more real over time. Do you see a difference between, governments using space resources to complete a government-funded initiative versus, turning that over for commercialization for government use? Does Canada or CSA have a position on those kind of resource uses with respect to where this is going in the UN?
Okay. I'll answer the second part first. I don't think Canada or the CSA has, and I don't want to talk to CSA, and one of my CSA colleagues can tell me I'm wrong, so please, but from my knowledge, Canada and CSA does not have an opinion on this particular area of space resources, either for commercial use or public use. Now, let's go to what the UN would say here and the debate that's going on here. I have a very strong sense from being in the room and in listening to the conversations which go on that governments using resources for ISRU is not effectively an issue. The issue really is that companies now are being formed and have been formed whose purpose is to go out, take something from a body out in space and sell it as a commercial venture. And the most vocal of the, I would say, of the opposition is comes from developing countries who again I think would are really arguing to say, and again, don't quote me on this, but I think are really arguing to say, hey, the treaties basically say that we should all be sharing in the wealth, one might say, or the resources in space. Therefore, what we would like to see here is not that you are forbidden to do that, but that we are going to be left out. That other countries are simply, this is going to be a race to make a lot of companies very rich, and with a resource that is supposed to be available to everybody. And that is the circle that needs to be squared at some level. How that's going to be done, I really don't know. I mean, say we've already heard from the space resources and other companies that they are seriously looking at how they can make the resources more available to a larger cross section of the world's population, one might say, in a very broad sense, to try and minimize this issue. But I would say that that's really the crux of the issue right now. But going back to your question about ISRU, I don't sense that anybody has particular issues if it's on a non-commercial basis, if it's done by governments. It's when the commercial sector get involved is that you start to see skins being prickled and issues being raised.
So, any other questions in the room? If not, I'd like to thank you once again, David. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we'll break for session. The next session, I guess it's the 4th. And the interactive session is 3:30. We'll be serving a light reception in the foyer.
Jeff, where's the dinner tonight? Is it here? Dinner is here?
Yes.
In this room?